Hi all, and welcome back for another behind the scenes process video. If you're seeing this in May of 2021, thank you, most esteemed Patreon patron. If you are seeing this in September of 2021, thanks for tuning in. For this month's Patreon piece, I found the cutest effing reference. It's this little discombobulated owl on a stick. He has the best little expression. There's fun, dynamic lighting. He's in front of a rich but simple background. Mwah! Chef's kiss to this reference. Again, I've mentioned it before I think, but I find a ton of my references on Unsplash. That's where I found this guy. Highly recommend copyright-free references there. So I've recently tried out a new mixed media paper. It's the Strathmore Mixed Media 400 series. And I think in the last video I mentioned that I didn't love how the color seemed to sit on top of the surface of this relatively smooth paper, but for the idea that I had in mind for this piece, that aesthetic was actually perfect. So what I mean by that is I knew I wanted a lot of the background showing through in the form of the owl, so I wanted an interesting, varied texture for the background, which this paper provides in spades. I used my Caran Neocolor IIs again, these water-soluble wax pastels, to put in the background and to get that watercolor texture. Again, highly recommend these, love these. I think I'll do a full artist demo for YouTube soon. Anyway, for this one in particular, I used a couple different blues to scribble in the background, mostly cooler blues, specifically the light blue, blue, and Prussian blue of the Caran Neocolor II series. Once that was all in, per usual, I used my Niji brush pen to melt those scribbles into cloudy watercolor texture. I used a lot of water this time. I really wanted that varied texture and some of those cool natural lines that form on the border of watercolor when you put a lot of water down and it kind of bubbles out. I also pushed the colors around a lot once they'd been saturated with water. I was really looking for something that had the right variation and also coverage throughout. So I actually ended up having to go back in with some blues on top of this while it was still wet to cover up some of the places that I'd exposed too much by putting on too much water. Then, once all of it was wetted, I let it dry all night because it was so saturated. I should also mention that this is the first time that I quote-unquote stretched my paper before using it. And what that means is that first I wetted it before putting anything on, just with plain clear water. This enlarged the fibers, so when it gets all buckly, and then while it was still damp, I sandwiched it between paper towels and sat a bunch of big heavy books on it overnight so that it would dry flat. And I'm new to this whole water game, I guess, but recently I've had issues with some of my paper buckling later on down the road when I put pastels on it, and I can't flatten the paper evenly, so doing this was a huge help. So, because the background was relatively saturated and a darker color than I sometimes do, I knew that I had to use a lot of soft pastel to put in the owl, especially on the lighter side. So I started there with putting in the sun highlights, and I wasn't really sure yet how I was going to let the background show through, but I knew that I wanted to put in those highlights at the very least. once I had one eye and kind of like half the head in, the highlighted half, I decided that the blue of the background that is, was the right value for all of the mids within the owl. So that meant that I would put in the sun highlights and the shadows / like dark feathers of the owl and leave the rest to show through. After I tried that effect on the head and decided that it was going to work, I continued putting in the rest of the sun highlights on the left side before moving on to the shadows. The reason for this is kind of twofold. It's nice to just stick to thinking in a certain color framework, so like once I have the color palette down for what I'm going to use in the lights, it's nice to stick to that and not have to switch it up all the time. And then the second is that soft pastels are super easy to mess up because they never dry and they're just like really fragile. And so moving from top to bottom, left to right is really crucial if you want to keep those clean lines and like a clean image and a strong contrast between background and figure. So like I said earlier, I needed to use mostly soft pastels, especially on the light side. The lighter value colored pencils and wax pastels just didn't really stand a chance on that blue background. Too much of the blue was showing through and it didn't really look like the powerful highlight that it was. Once I started on the shadow side, I tried this fun new camera angle, but found that my arm was mostly in the way whenever I put down a mark, so... On this side, I was able to use a lot more of the colored pencil and wax pastel because the darker values of those were more opaque, so less of the blue background showed through. This meant that I was able to do a lot of smaller lines and therefore was able to mix up the shape and mark making a little more, which was a really nice change of pace after finishing the large side of highlights that was mostly just like putting down pretty thick, opaque, soft pastel lines, which is fun in its own way, but it was nice to mix it up. With the shadows and dark feather spots put in, I moved on to the feet / stick that he's standing on. And for these I used the same principle here, and I ended up really enjoying how the feet just kind of come out of the blue, literally. For the stick, I actually wasn't sure I was going to put that much of it in, but I ended up feeling like the texture was different enough from the owl while still implementing a lot of the same techniques, so it was a nice kind of change of pace again, and it really grounded the pretty ethereal owl, so it was nice to have that in there, kind of tethering it to this world. So this owl with the highlights and the shadows put in and everything else kind of showing through, for some reason made me think of those scenes in superhero movies when like a flashlight or something, or even like a horror movie when a flashlight moves over a character's face who's hiding in the dark, and you see the light go across their face, and you kind of make them out, and then the light will like go back to focus on them and they've disappeared. So I decided to title this piece Transient Vigil, kind of with the thought that this little guy is watching over us, at least until we notice him, and then he's out. Alrighty, well that pretty much wraps things up for this guy. Thanks again to anyone out there seeing this. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, bye.